Welcome to the New Brunswick Debrief, where we cover stories from across the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Wolastoqey that now make up New Brunswick. We want to talk about the issues that matter and provide a social justice alternative to the corporate media monopoly. My name is Tobin Haley, and I am your host. Today's show is about abortion access in New Brunswick. We often think that the issue of abortion in Canada was settled in the 1980s. But as you will hear today, there are still major barriers to access to abortion in the province, including a refusal on the part of the province to pay for procedural abortions in clinics. Until 2015 in New Brunswick, in order to get Medicare to cover your abortion, 2 doctors had to approve it, and it had to be done by an OB/GYN in a hospital. Today, you don't need 2 doctors' approval, but the abortion still has to happen in one of the 3 hospitals where the procedure is available. If you want to use a clinic, you have to pay out of pocket. This is different than the rest of the country, where you can use your Medicare card to get a procedural abortion in a clinic. Because of these barriers, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has had to initiate a lawsuit to have the restrictions repealed. At the center of this struggle for access to abortion is Clinic 554, which is run by Dr. Adrian Edgar. Clinic 554 is the only family practice in the province that provides procedural abortions in a clinical setting. Here to talk to us about abortion access are Tracy Glynn, a founder of the New Brunswick Media Co-op, Dr. Adrian Edgar, Medical Director of Clinic 554, and Assistant Professor of Medicine at Dalhousie University and Memorial University, and Dr. Kerri Froc, Associate Professor of Law at the University of New Brunswick and advisor to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association's litigation team fighting for abortion access. Tracy Glynn, Dr. Froc, and myself are all members of Reproductive Justice New Brunswick. We are going to first go to Tracy. Tracy, can you tell us about the New Brunswick Media Co-op's coverage of abortion in the province?
Yeah, so the ME Media Co-op, so I did a count before the show, and we've published over 100 stories on abortion access. And some of those stories have been our most popular stories. They're stories about government action, or I should say inaction, on abortion access, but also testimonies too from people who have accessed abortion or tried to access an abortion and the challenges they faced. So like I said, some of our most popular stories, including a thoughtful piece by Judy Burwell on the death of Dr. Henry Morgentaler. That was a really important piece because throughout Dr. Morgentaler's life, the media unfortunately demonized him, and which contributed to putting his life at risk. And we know that abortion providers have been killed, so that was an important piece. We've covered stories of the closure of the Morgentaler Clinic in Fredericton and then the subsequent opening of Clinic 554. We've covered the movement for not only abortion access but reproductive justice and tried to explain what reproductive justice is. The ability of people being able to parent if they so choose, and in a way that, in a manner of dignity too. And abortion is part of that, having access to abortion. So when the Morgentaler Clinic did close, there was a movement that sprung up in New Brunswick to this reproductive justice movement. So we had seasoned abortion access advocates like Judy Burwell, Simone Leibovich, working with folks who were new to the issue but wanted to finally have to finally remove the barriers to abortion access in the province.
And sorry, but was that the Fredericton Youth Feminists? Yes,
yeah. So the Fredericton Youth Feminists was part of that. So different generations of feminists came together. So that was really cool. So we had the Fredericton Youth Feminists were a group of Fredericton area high school students who organized the largest rally ever seen for abortion access on the front lawn of the legislature. So more than 700 people filled the legislature lawn right after the closure of the Morgentaler Clinic. And they also helped Reproductive Justice MB raise over $100,000 to reopen the clinic, but this time as a family practice, so not just as an abortion clinic that Dr. Morgentaler had run, but as a family practice run by Dr. Adrian Edgar, who we will hear from later in the show. Yeah. So this clinic does not only provide abortions, but also provides trans health care, provides health care to groups of people in our society that have been made marginalized or vulnerable, people living with addictions, people living with HIV. So this clinic's been so important. But unfortunately, we have a government that does not support funding abortion services at the clinic, which has made it impossible for this clinic to continue operating. So,
and there was a campaign to save the clinic? I mean, yes. Save Clinic 554. And how did the NB Media Co-op cover the campaign and the subsequent challenges that that Dr. Edgar and the staff there encountered?
Yeah, so we were there for every rally, every action that they have taken. We've tried to respond to the health minister, the premier's excuses for why they have not removed the archaic legislation that prohibits funding of abortion services in non-hospital settings. Mm-hmm. So that's been really important. I think we've made a difference too in the media landscape, where we've noticed over the past 10 years that other media doesn't provide, that space for anti-choice, misogynist voices, but rather they're pressing the politicians. They're covering it as the problem that it is, that we do have serious barriers to abortion access in this province, and so I think the Media Co-op has been part of being a unabashedly pro-choice media has, I think, brought the other media along, and I think hopefully will be part of finally removing this archaic legislation that we have that no other province has. It was only brought in by the McKenna government to stop Dr. Morgentaler from opening a clinic, and so it's long past time for the current government to remove that archaic piece of legislation or that regulation.
I know, and I can't believe, I mean, you and I were involved in reproductive, well, it wasn't called Reproductive Justice New Brunswick at the time, but in the reproductive justice movement in New Brunswick, almost 20 years ago now, and we're still having this conversation.
Yeah.
And the two-doctor rule was only removed in 2015. So it does feel like this has been going on forever, and we're now here having this conversation. So yeah. I look forward to the ND Media Co-op coverage of the lawsuit, which Dr. Kerri Froc is going to come in and talk to us about.
Yes, for sure. So we published an open letter from the University of New Brunswick law professors, including Dr. Kerri Froc, when a peaceful protest was removed from the legislature. So I think the movement for abortion access and reproductive justice is growing, and I'm sure that not just removing the regulation that stops Medicare-funded abortions in clinic settings, but also addressing the fact that you can't get a Medicare-funded abortion in Charlotte County, you can't get one in Restigouche County or anywhere else outside of Moncton or Bathurst, and we also have to have other supports in place, like for childcare, transportation for when people do have to travel for an abortion.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And now joining us is Dr. Kerri Froc and Dr. Adrian Edgar. Dr. Edgar, you are the only doctor in the province providing procedural abortions in a clinic setting. What's that been like? And how is Clinic 554 doing?
Well, the clinic has had to drastically reduce our services. We did have an entire family practice and a broad scope of healthcare we were providing. We were doing a lot of HIV and trans health and addiction medicine, primary care for the full spectrum from children to the elderly. So now we're, just financially just trying to trickle along and provide what we think is not available anywhere else, and so that remains to be abortions.
And Dr. Froc, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is suing the provincial government around access to abortion in clinics. You're on the litigation team. You're an advisor for the litigation team. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the lawsuit and what's going on with that?
Right. So there was, Canadian Civil Liberties put the government on notice that unless it was going to amend Regulation 8420, which is the regulation that prevents clinics from being funded to do abortions, unless they were going to change that regulation, that they would be suing the government, claiming that this regulation is contravening the Charter on the basis of primarily Section 15, which is equality rights, or saying that this is discriminatory, and also that it violates Section 7, which concerns life, liberty, and security of the person. Because in 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada said that impediments to abortion under the Criminal Code were unconstitutional because it violated women's security of the person.
Yeah, and how did we get here? I mean, my understanding is that, clinic abortions, procedural abortions in clinics are provided virtually everywhere else in the country. How did we end up in this situation?
That's a very good question, and all I can say is, I'm a relative newcomer to New Brunswick, so I'm learning the history of the province as many of our students do in law school. But essentially, there's been restrictions on abortion in New Brunswick for a very long time. The ones that we're concerned with right now, Regulation 8420, those provisions were really put in order to keep standalone clinic abortions out. When Morgentaler back in the day indicated that he had some intentions in the late 80s to come to New Brunswick to set up a clinic, that's when the restrictions were imposed to really make it not viable to set up a clinic here. Now, there was a Supreme Court of Canada decision in 1993 indicating that some of those restrictions, essentially saying that doctors that perform abortions outside the hospital setting were committing professional misconduct. The funding restrictions. Very similar regulations were struck down in Nova Scotia by the Supreme Court of Canada, and approximately in 1994, I think, New Brunswick's court also struck down some of the provisions, but the funding restrictions have still kind of remained around, kind of the residue of this unconstitutional regime. Henry Morgentaler started an action to get those struck down as well, but he was mired in procedural motions. The government took him, claimed that he didn't have standing to bring that action. So he died before that litigation could really be brought to an end. So, and it's really difficult to take on the government in any litigation. They play the war of attrition. So it's simply, the reason it's been around so long is no one's had the stamina and the financial wherewithal really to pick up where Dr. Morgentaler left off.
And Dr. Edgar, is it true that procedural abortions provided in clinics are safer and cheaper for the province?
Yes. There's data to suggest that procedural abortions in an outpatient setting, so not in a hospital setting, are more cost-effective to the healthcare system, even than medication abortions.
And sorry to interrupt, but that's exactly what the Supreme Court of Canada found in 1993 as well. So it drives me wild to see that misrepresentation being repeated in the current debates that are happening in the legislature in 2021, because that was 30 years ago that the Supreme Court of Canada found that was not true. But yet this misrepresentation just gets repeated as a political talking point.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the most important thing that you pointed out isn't the economical savings for the province, it's the human costs and the suffering associated with forcing people to go to a hospital, particularly during a pandemic, for a service that is more safely provided outside of hospital. So there's a real lack of government listening to medical science on the issue of abortion. And when you said, how do we get here? I mean, I think we have to talk about New Brunswick having a real problem separating church and state. and the role of misogyny and sexism that we allow to continue to permeate our regulations.
And Dr. Edgar, you're on the front lines of this. You're seeing the real impact of the inability of New Brunswickers to access procedural abortions in a clinical setting. Can you talk about what some of the barriers to accessing abortion are right now in New Brunswick?
There's too many to detail in a brief interview setting, I think. New Brunswick, as a rural province with a large number of people living geographically away from urban centers, has to consider how do we really regionalize healthcare? How do we make sure that everyone in every region has the most access that we could provide? And we do that in other settings. If we only have one, cardiac surgical team in one city, and people have to travel for that care, we're always thinking, okay, what can we do to attract another team? How could we fund another team? How could we get more services in other areas, right? Because everyone acknowledges that it's incredibly burdensome to try and go to one spot for care. And when it comes to abortion, to have a team that's been there for decades, that's well trained, in fact, probably the best trained in the province, and then to have the province withhold access from patients for no reason it's just blatantly disrespectful. It's blatantly discriminatory. I think we also have to think about global warming. We have to think about the fact that New Brunswick has had 2 once-in-a-lifetime floods in the last 5 years, and we're going to have more. And so when the highways are flooded out and people can't get to the hospitals that are really too far away and too few to begin with, for a procedure that's timely, that's a problem. And in winter, which New Brunswick is in most of the year, we also have roads that are closed because of whiteouts and storms. And we also have to talk about poverty. We have to talk about who are the people who don't own a car, who couldn't go to another region to have a procedure that, again, is safer the earlier it's done. So this is not something we can delay. It's not comparable to, a hip replacement or a knee replacement, which is also a very long wait list and a service that we'd like to improve. It's different. You want to do what is safest for the patient, and because of this regulation, we don't meet that mark in New Brunswick.
Yeah, the situation here does feel very dire around abortion. It's an urgent matter, and it does feel very dire. Dr. Froc, in response to this really difficult situation, you tented out on the legislature this summer in protest. I was there and I saw you tenting out on the legislature lawn.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What brought you to do that and what happened?
Yeah, so I don't like camping, but I was just fed up with the government digging in its heels. Reason is on our side. You've talked about the benefits about having abortions being provided closer to people in a clinic setting. So reason is on our side. Financially, it's on our side. It's much more cost efficient to provide abortions in that setting. And legally, the law is on our side because the provincial government is transgressing not only the Canada Health Act, from which they've had clawbacks of the transfer payments, which the government has brushed off, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic and every health dollar counts. And it's contrary to the Constitution, and there's no question in my mind and many other experts' minds that this is totally unconstitutional. So what do you do with a government who purports to be a business-oriented government that's not listening to the economics, not listening to reason, not abiding by the law? I just felt like this is, a political statement was the last resort. After all of those. So we had a vigil for Clinic 554, and as a result, myself and a former student decided that we would simply tent there overnight to keep the momentum going for the next morning and to continue on the protest the next morning. My student had tented out there the weekend before, no issues, but somehow the Sergeant at Arms had the idea that he was able to disrupt our protest and seize our property by doing that. And in doing so, there was a printed out statement with a number of so-called rules saying that we couldn't establish tents out there. I kept on asking, well, where does this come from? What law? They couldn't answer me. The media, as it was, they were covering a trial that was right next door. So when our tents got seized,
I forgot about that. When the police came and took your tents.
It was the security of the legislature. The police were just there to keep the peace with one middle-aged professor and one former law student. I'm not quite sure what peace they were anticipating might be at risk, but in any event, there was a large gathering there. Our tents were seized. The media came over, and as a result of that, of the media attention, they had to answer for it. And the answer was, well, we are entitled to do this because of a kind of an arcane common law rule that's called parliamentary privilege, which essentially means that in order not to disrupt legislative business, they're entitled to secure the legislative building.
Right, so they just did whatever they wanted to stop this demonstration.
Well, as I said, it was supposedly based on this arcane rule, but as it turns out, it doesn't apply, number one, because the legislature wasn't sitting. And number two, it doesn't apply to the legislative grounds. So, it was without a legal basis. It was illegal. Yeah. So not only did it violate our freedom of expression and our rights to assemble for protesting, it had no legal basis whatsoever.
Thank you so much for letting us know what happened, because it was very distressing when it occurred.
I couldn't believe it. As a law professor, I'm always telling my students, the state can't act without a basis in law, and here we are.
And it seems like they're doing it all over the place, doesn't it? Abortion, taking away tents, moving protesters off the legislative lawn. Well, Dr. Edgar, I do kind of want to go out on a high note here. It's clear that providing procedural and abortions in a clinical setting is part of a broader inclusive medical practice that you have. Can you talk about what an inclusive, truly accessible medical system for New Brunswick would look like?
Well, I think Dr. Froc raises a good point that you expect government to behave lawfully, and I think that our elected officials are making a lot of knee-jerk decisions that are not reflective of any standard of care. What the rest of the country, in my experience, is doing, and other places that I've worked, is really evolving, really trying to make care evidence-based, which in medicine means we do studies that are reproducible and reliable and large-scale, and we try and find data that we can use to predict what would be safest for a patient or a patient population. And with abortion, we know that if we do abortions in hospitals, the risk of a person having bleeding that requires treatment in hospital after the fact, being admitted to hospital after the fact, having a repeat emergency room visit after the fact, needing psychological care after the fact, having an infection that requires treatment after the fact. All of these risks increase if you provide abortion in hospital. So for our government to limit abortion funding to the least safe site obviously makes no medical sense and is not inclusive for women or anyone with a uterus, like a trans or non-binary person. And I think that's what's important about what the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is trying to say, is that this is excluding a particular set of people in New Brunswick from healthcare, and we wouldn't do it to the other set. If there was a regulation that specifically excluded men from the safest procedure available to them, it would not be acceptable. And when I try and have conversations with people within the Conservative Party of New Brunswick, for instance, about why they're fighting the Canadian Civil Liberties Association in court, I've heard things like, well, the pro-choice protesters should never have gone to Minister Ted Fleming's house, who was the health minister previously. Now he's the Attorney General, who's making the decision to go to court. And my point to them is that I've been asking for a bubble zone legislation to protect my house for since we've lived here, So, and I know that people have been asking for that for abortion providers since abortion was being provided. And the government has always said that they don't feel that there's any particular reason to protect abortion providers. But for some reason, if a couple teenagers put some signs on the lawn of a health minister, who's now the Attorney General, we're going to have a province that will continue to discriminate against vulnerable patients. It's a knee-jerk province. That same minister has spoken at anti-abortion rallies. We've got footage of him. We've got footage of the current health minister, footage of the premier. These are people who go to church every weekend and cannot seem to understand that their values are not applicable to everyone's situations. The people that we see at the clinic are a full gamut of humans with human lives that matter and who should be able to make decisions about those lives. So a lot of the people who come to the clinic are mothers that have several children and are trying to prioritize their children and trying to prioritize their family and their family's health and well-being. A lot of the people we see are teenagers who didn't have access to appropriate sexual education in New Brunswick because New Brunswick still has no standardized sex ed.
Dr. Edgar, we're seeing all kinds of different emergency responses in relation to some of the barriers to access to healthcare, to education, to even employment in response to the pandemic. Why aren't we seeing the same kind of emergency responses for abortion care, and what would that look like?
Well, exactly. The hospitals in New Brunswick, we only have 3 that provide abortions, and within them they limit the access to the first trimester. Well, not everyone can find out they're pregnant or get to a place that offers abortion within that small window. We're the only, Clinic 554 is the only provider of second trimester abortion care in New Brunswick, and our bus routes have been limited, our public buses are limited in the number of people that can go on them. Airports and airlines that service New Brunswick have completely withdrawn from the province. So if people are supposed to go to another province to access a service that we could provide in New Brunswick, but they can't get there and the province still won't provide interim funding, we have to say, what is the role of misogyny in the regulations that this province is supporting?
I really hope policymakers are listening to this. Thank you so much, Dr. Edgar and Dr. Froc, for being here and joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Since the episode was taped, there's been some developments in the legal case. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association went to the Court of Queen's Bench in May to ask for standing to advance the constitutional case. That decision just came down from Chief Justice Tracy Glynn, who found that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association can move forward as a public interest litigant. She found that the government's position in opposing that application was unreasonable, and therefore she awarded $5,000 in costs against the government to be paid to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. So from here, the case will go on likely to discoveries and then ultimately to be litigated on the main constitutional issue.
And that's it for our show. Thank you so much for joining us. As our show continues to develop, we hope to hear from you about the issues that you want to see covered. You can email us at nbdebrief@chco.tv and visit our website at nbmediacoop.org. Upcoming topics will include the rental housing crisis and language rights. The New Brunswick Debrief is a partnership between the NB Media Co-op and Charlotte County Television, 2 independent media outlets. See you next time.
No downtown is from this town, long walk, long and clean now. Yes, it is, yes, it is, yes, it is. Company keeps out the phone to me, they say, it's our city, our town. Sure it is, sure it is, sure it is.